History is usually remembered through noise, the clash of swords, the screams of men, the thunder of hooves and shields colliding. But the greatest turning points in history are rarely born in noise. They are born in silence. Sometimes the fate of empires is not decided when armies charge, but in the quiet moment before they move, in a pause, in a single decision made inside a human mind. The Battle of Zama was one of those moments. This was not simply Rome versus Carthage. It was not just another clash of armies on an open field. Zama was a crossroads of history, where two ways of thinking, two philosophies of power, and two possible futures stood face to face in silence. On one side stood a man who had terrified Rome for years, a commander who crossed mountains with war elephants, a name whispered in fear across Italy. On the other side stood someone different, quieter, younger, a commander who did not rush, who did not shout, who believed that victory began before the battle. Both men were brilliant, both were legends, but history would choose only one path. The morning of Zama was calm. No battle cries echoed across the plains. No arrows darkened the sky. Even the wind seemed cautious, as if it sensed what was about to change. The ground beneath their feet had seen blood before, and it knew it would see blood again. Yet the first strike of this battle was not delivered by a sword. It was delivered by the mind. Rome was no longer the Rome that had panicked years earlier. It had tasted defeat. It had buried its dead. And instead of breaking, it learned. Carthage, however, still stood in the shadow of past victories. Old tactics, old fears, old glory. But history is unforgiving. It does not reward repetition. It rewards adaptation. Before the first elephant charged, before the first shield shattered, the outcome of Zama was already taking shape, not because one army was stronger, but because one had changed. There are moments in history when the sword is still in its scabbard, yet destinies have already shifted. Zama was one of those moments. This was not a loud beginning. It was a quiet birth, the quiet birth of Roman dominance. Rome did not arrive at Zama seeking glory. It arrived there because it had no other choice. Years before this moment, Rome believed itself untouchable. Its legions were disciplined. Its allies were loyal. Its republic seemed eternal. And then one man shattered that illusion. His name was Hannibal Barca. When Hannibal crossed the Alps with war elephants, Rome thought it was madness, a desperate gamble, a spectacle meant to fail, but it didn't. What followed was not just a series of defeats. It was psychological warfare. At the Trebia River, Roman blood soaked the cold ground. At Lake Trasimene, an entire Roman army vanished into ambush. And then came Cannae. Cannae was not merely a defeat. It was a massacre. Rome lost tens of thousands of men in a single day. Senators, veteran officers, entire bloodlines erased. For the first time in its history, Rome felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of death, but fear of collapse. Cities defected. Allies hesitated. Mothers stopped asking when their sons would return. And yet, Rome did not surrender. This is where Rome became something different. Instead of chasing Hannibal blindly, Rome chose patience. It accepted humiliation. It avoided direct confrontation. It endured. Years passed. Hannibal remained undefeated, but trapped. He could destroy Roman armies, yet he could not destroy Rome itself. And Rome learned a brutal lesson. Victory does not always belong to the strongest. It belongs to the one who lasts. Out of this realization emerged a new kind of Roman commander, Scipio Africanus, young, observant, unemotional. Scipio did not worship Rome's traditions blindly. He studied Rome's failures. He studied Hannibal. He understood something others refused to admit. Hannibal was not winning because he was lucky. He was winning because he thought differently. So Scipio did the unthinkable. Instead of defending Rome endlessly, he carried the war to Carthage itself. To Carthage. This was not revenge, it was strategy. By threatening Carthage, Rome forced Hannibal to do something he had avoided for years: come home. For the first time, Hannibal was no longer the hunter, he was the defender. Rome, once bleeding and desperate, now dictated the battlefield. This is why Rome came to Zama, not for pride, not for vengeance, but because Rome had learned how empires survive. They adapt, they absorb pain, they change. Zama was not the beginning of Rome's rise. It was the moment Rome proved it deserved to rise. By the time the armies faced each other near Zama, Hannibal knew something was different. This was not Italy. This was not the land of ambushes, rivers, and narrow passes. This was open ground. Here, there would be no hiding. For the first time in many years, Hannibal did not control the rhythm of the war. And so he turned to the one weapon that had once made Rome tremble: the elephants. To the ancient world, war elephants were not simply animals. They were terror given flesh. They towered over men. Their footsteps shook the earth. Their trumpeting shattered courage before steel ever touched steel. Roman soldiers remembered them well. They remembered how elephants broke formations, how they crushed shields, how disciplined lines dissolved into panic. Hannibal knew this memory still lived inside Roman minds. Fear, once planted, never truly dies. And so Hannibal placed his elephants at the front of his army, not just as a weapon, but as a message. You have faced me before. You remember what happens. But this time, Rome was waiting. Across the field stood Scipio Africanus, quiet, observant, unmoved by spectacle. Scipio did not fear the elephants. He had studied them. He understood something Hannibal could not change. Elephants were powerful, but they were also unpredictable. They were not machines, they were animals. And animals panic. Instead of ordering his legions to stand tight, Scipio did something revolutionary. He opened the Roman formation. Long corridors formed between units, straight paths running through the heart of the army. To an untrained eye, it looked like madness, like weakness. But it was a trap. When the signal was given, Hannibal unleashed the elephants. They charged. The ground thundered beneath them. Dust rose into the air. Men felt the vibration in their bones. For a moment, it looked like the old nightmare returning. Then Rome answered. Trumpets screamed, horns blared, metal clashed against metal. The sudden noise shattered the elephants' focus. They hesitated. Some veered off course. Others panicked. Instead of slamming into Roman lines, they ran into the empty corridors, guided straight through the army like water through stone. And then something catastrophic happened. Several elephants turned back, straight into Hannibal's own troops. Men screamed, lines broke, cavalry scattered. The weapon meant to terrify Rome now crushed Carthaginian soldiers beneath its feet. Hannibal watched his greatest symbol of dominance become uncontrollable chaos. This was the moment the war truly turned. The elephants were not just neutralized, they were reversed. Rome had not defeated them with strength, but with understanding. For the first time in his career, Hannibal realized he had been outthought. The elephants had been his last hope to recreate the fear of earlier years. But fear no longer ruled Rome. Discipline did. Zama was not won when the elephants charged. It was won when they failed. Because in that failure, Rome proved something to the world. Raw power can be redirected. Terror can be studied. And even legends can be dismantled. Calmly, Hannibal was still a genius. Still a commander unmatched in experience. But at Zama, genius met preparation, and preparation prevailed. When the thunder of the elephants finally faded, when the dust they had kicked into the air began to settle slowly back onto the earth, the Battle of Zama revealed its true nature. There were no monsters left on the field. no symbols of terror, no myths to hide behind. Only men remained, and with them, discipline, exhaustion, patience, and will. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire battle, because now victory would no longer belong to reputation, nor to past triumphs, nor to fear. It would belong to the side that could think more clearly under pressure. As the Roman legions advanced, they did not shout. They did not rush forward in blind fury. Each step was measured, deliberate, almost mechanical, as if this moment had been rehearsed long before the first sword was ever drawn. The Carthaginian infantry, by contrast, carried the weight of years of warfare on their shoulders. They were brave, unquestionably so, but they were tired, worn down by endless campaigns, their bodies still strong, yet their minds stretched thin by survival. At first glance, this difference was invisible, but in battle, it is always the invisible cracks that decide everything. When the Roman front line began to fall back, it did not look like strategy. It looked like weakness. The Carthaginian troops surged forward, believing the Roman formation was finally breaking, unaware that this retreat had been calculated to the smallest detail. This was one of Scipio Africanus's most dangerous illusions. Scipio was not a commander who ruled the battlefield through shouting or spectacle. He watched, he waited, and he struck only when certainty replaced hope. Suddenly, the Roman legions stopped. The lines closed again, shields locked together with cold precision, spears leveled forward in perfect unison. This was no longer chaos. It was a system coming back online. The Carthaginian soldiers collided with this wall again and again, each impact draining their strength, each attempt met not with rage, but with discipline. And then came the final movement. From the flanks, Roman cavalry returned to the field, not as a surprise, but as the final piece of a plan already set in motion long before the battle began. The Carthaginian army found itself compressed from every direction, trapped between iron discipline and closing steel, with no clear path of escape. Years earlier at Cannae, Rome had suffered this exact nightmare. Now, history was reversing itself. Hannibal Barca understood immediately what this moment meant. This was not panic. This was not confusion. This was recognition. Hannibal knew the battle was slipping beyond his control, and unlike reckless commanders, he refused to turn defeat into meaningless slaughter. The Battle of Zama was not decided by superior numbers, nor by physical strength, nor by blind courage. It was decided by patience, by adaptation, by a willingness to learn from humiliation. Rome won not because it was invincible, but because it had changed. Because it had learned that not every victory comes through attack, that sometimes waiting is a weapon, and sometimes retreat is simply another form of advance. At Zama, intelligence defeated strength, and history remembers victories like this long after the sounds of battle have faded. There are defeats that crush a man, and there are defeats that define him. At Zama, Hannibal lost the battle, but he did not lose himself. This defeat was not born of fear. It was not the result of panic or chaos. It was the moment when reality became impossible to deny. The Carthaginian army was closing in on itself. Roman infantry pressed from the front. Cavalry tightened the flanks. The circle grew smaller with every passing minute. This is the moment when many commanders destroy their own legacy, when pride takes control, when desperation demands blood, when thousands are sent to die not for victory, but to protect a name. Hannibal refused that path. Hannibal Barca had spent a lifetime on battlefields. He understood victory, but more importantly, he understood defeat. And he understood something most leaders never learn. Sometimes retreat is not cowardice. Sometimes it is the last remaining form of honor. Hannibal did not prolong the slaughter. He did not sacrifice his soldiers to illusion. He accepted what the battlefield had already decided. Zama was no longer a contest of weapons. It was a verdict, and Hannibal listened. This decision did not make him a victor, but it preserved his dignity. Rome had won the battle, but Hannibal had not been broken. That is why this moment matters, because what remained on the field was not a shattered commander, but the end of an era. For years, Hannibal had been Rome's nightmare, a name spoken in fear, a shadow hanging over the Republic. Now that shadow faded, not in disgrace, but in silence. This was not a small defeat. It reshaped the world. Yet even in victory, Rome understood what it had faced. Scipio Africanus celebrated his triumph, but he did not mock his enemy, because Scipio knew he had not defeated an ordinary general. He had defeated one of history's greatest minds. Zama was more than the birth of Roman dominance. It was a rare lesson written into history itself. Victory does not always equal greatness, and defeat does not always mean humiliation. Hannibal lost, but he was not erased. He remains, not as a failure, but as a warning, a lesson, and a legend, because history remembers not only those who win, but those who know how to lose without becoming small. Zama did not simply end a war. It revealed how history truly moves. Rome did not triumph because it possessed greater strength, nor because its soldiers were braver than those who stood against them. Rome prevailed because it learned, slowly, painfully, and honestly, from every defeat that nearly destroyed it. And Hannibal Barca did not fail because he lacked brilliance. He failed because even the greatest genius cannot overcome an enemy that is willing to change its very nature. At Zama, two forces collided. One was built on individual brilliance, daring maneuvers, and fear. The other was built on patience, discipline, and memory. History chose the second. From this moment forward, Rome was no longer a republic reacting to danger. It became a system designed to survive it, a machine that absorbed pain, studied its enemies, and returned stronger each time it fell. Zama teaches us something timeless. Empires are not born in moments of triumph. They are born in moments of reflection. And defeat, when faced honestly, can be more powerful than victory. Hannibal left Zama without a crown, but not without dignity. Rome left Zama victorious, but also forever changed. Because after the dust settles, after the armies disappear, after the names fade into stone and parchment, history does not ask who fought harder. It asks a quieter question: who learned and who did not?